Despite several years of experience of teaching in person, when I started to create art tutorials on YouTube, it took me a while to kind of find my groove and figure out what people were looking for, what format people preferred, and honestly, I'm still experimenting. Because I have experienced such a learning curve, I thought it was time that I recreate one of my older videos. So I have a couple of videos that have been very popular despite the fact that they were a less than stellar video. So in this video, I'm going to basically recreate one of the videos that I've made before, which is my Loose Watercolor Peony tutorial. This is great for beginners and great for anybody who loves that loose, more modern color theory style tutorial. Now, before we get started, I am working on some cold pressed paper. So there's a little bit of a texture to it. And I have just kind of a sketched out general position. So I have basically a large circle here and a slightly smaller circle here, and just some little lines. Kind of really, this is what I did to indicate that I'd like some leaves to go here, and then kind of a stem line coming out from this smaller one. So I will not follow them religiously, but it just kind of helps me to figure out space, overall space, and just kind of what I'm working with. Okay, to mix my kind of infamous peachy tone, we're going to use really some of the colors that I recommend in my beginner palette. So we're going to start with some alizarin crimson. Because I'm going to be working loose, I'm going to add quite a bit of pigment. So when you're working loose, one of the biggest things you're trying to avoid is the paint getting too dry at the wrong time. So we are going to mix quite a bit of pigment here. And so I have alizarin crimson, just a glob of that kind of on my palette, and I'm going to go into lemon yellow. Not a ton, enough to dirty my yellow, but enough to kind of warm it up and give it a little bit more interest. We'll pull that in too. So again, I want a big chunk of this pigment on here. So that I don't have to mix it in the middle of working. So this is looking a little orangey, which means I need more alizarin crimson. But when you're trying to clean out your paint, that's kind of how it goes. So I do want it to be a little orangey. So we're going for kind of a peachy tone. So I created this color originally when working with the, I think it's called a Coral Crush Peony, and they have a corally color. So I wanted to mimic that, but I prefer a softer tone overall. So I'm actually going to be adding a lot of white in. Now you can just add less pigment to your paper, but when working loose and including those pastel-y tones, I highly recommend just using the power of white watercolor paint. So see how that's so much softer? And that's with just a little bit. I'm going to actually pull out my tube. I'm going to just add some directly to, oh, I guess I should have mixed that. Add some to my palette, add some to my mixing plate. So I might need to add a little bit more of that yellow again. Just it's a little too pinky, but we'll test it out right here. There we go. That's getting to the creaminess that I want. Okay. Then when there we go. And that's the secret. With a transparent color like this, especially, use white to your advantage. So adding white to a color desaturates it and will allow it to have just a different level of depth. So you can still have the same amount of pigment down, but it won't be as bright or intense. See how nicely that's drying? That's what we're going for. Okay. So now we have our main pink color pretty much mixed. I still have a little bit of white in here I can throw in if I need to. I'm going to include a yellow tone, so I'm going to throw in what we already have. So I'm just going to have this off to the side, but I'm also going to mix a little bit with this raw sienna just to deepen it a little bit. I'll probably go in with some raw sienna. There's just some unmixed raw sienna, but I just like to have things out on my palette. And then for the greenery, since this is bright and rich, I don't want to get too rich or saturated with my greenery. I want it to be fairly muted. So I'm going to pull, this is sap green, but I think I'm going to be playing mostly with my Terre Verte. This is, let's see if I can pull it out here. So Terre Verte in the yellow shade. It is a beautiful desaturated green, one of my very favorites. Oh no! And one that has been loved to pieces and apparently needs to be repurchased. So I guess I'm working with what we've got here. So I'm just going to agitate this. By adding water and continuing to agitate it, it should be reactivated enough so that when I do add the greenery, we're able to include it. But see how those two just dance together really nicely. Add in that little bit of yellow, and we're going to be happy. I am also going to add a little bit of water to my burnt umber, which is this one, and just have that off to the side. So I might need to desaturate things just a touch. All right, try and solve your problems, your color problems, beforehand before you start working on a loose piece, because the hardest part with working loose is working fast. So if you can kind of test things off on a scrap piece of paper here, that will help you immensely as you're kind of starting out. So that's kind of my favorite peach. It's mostly alizarin crimson. It's adding a little bit of that lemon yellow in there just to kind of give it that orangey, little bit extra dimension, and then adding quite a bit of white in there to soften the color overall. But again, depending on how much you want to do. And if you haven't seen my tip video for working with loose watercolors, I'll have that linked down below. It has 5 tips that I swear by when you are working with loose watercolors, and it will be, I will be using them today, but I might forget to mention them because it's just what I always do. Okay, so one thing you want to do, I like to have a bigger brush, so I'm working with a size 10 round brush. This is a watercolor brush. It's very thirsty. I mixed with kind of an all-purpose brush, and this is what I recommend getting if you are a beginner, because the water is easier to control with this one, but this is what I will be using. I have some pictures of some peonies, and it just helps to have some of them up so that I can see, okay, this is the shape that we're going for. They have a lot of large petals, so they don't have like a lot of the little petals in the middle like some peony varieties do have, and they have those beautiful yellow centers. So we're going to try and capture that today. Now the biggest trick if you're trying to control your water, always dab it off. So here off to the side, I'm going to shift you over just a little. You see I have a rag here. It's just a towel that got stained, and so now it lives in my studio instead of in our pantry, in our linen closet. And so that's what I'm using. Now where you start is up to you. I generally start with kind of the petal that is closest to you, but we might mix it up here a little bit. For this bloom, this one that's a little bit larger up here, this larger circle that I created, I want to show a lot of the center. And so I think I'm actually going to start back here because these petals will be foreshortened a little bit. Going back and adding pigment, which is just kind of a nervous habit of mine. And then I'm adding a little bit more water after I've placed the initial pigment down. And you see that I've done a little bit of a wiggle up here. And that's just to kind of try and capture that kind of organic edge of the peony. So the way that it cups. So I'm adding a little bit more water. I haven't added any more pigment. I'm not adding a ton of water. The biggest thing that you can do to gain more control is to have less water. You can always add a little bit more. So dab it off. when I want to keep these fairly wet and keep building up this pigment at the bottom. So now we're getting into kind of some of these foreshortened petals here. This is why drawing is so important. Being able to draw what you see really helps when you're painting and you're working with these quick brush strokes. So now for these petals that are more in this front and center, so not the ones I'm dabbing extra pigment in now, just adding this pigment in while it's still wet, so that, not there, down here, so that it will have kind of a nice bleed. This is going to create a bloom. That's okay. I don't mind that. We can fix it later. So for these petals down here, I want to go with shorter strokes because they are, again, they're foreshortened. So adding a little bit of water, dabbing off any excess. Allowing these items to connect will help to create a bleed and a softer look. So a bleed is when the two colors kind of come together. We'll be using that to our advantage a little bit more even later. And I like to allow kind of these outer layers to get softer in color. So again, adding some water to my brush, not necessarily more pigment every single time I move over. There'd be a little bit more interest here. There we go. So while some of these are still wet, I'm going to tap in some more color at kind of the base, just so that it will bleed out and have a little bit more emphasis and focus here at the base. Kind of helps to give it a little bit more of that 3D look. But it does mean that I need to lighten some other areas. So I'm going to clean my brush off, take off any excess water so it's damp, and I'm going to lift up some of this color here and kind of allow that to fade, just to kind of soften everything a little bit. So some people are really good at doing that naturally and on the go. I kind of have to fake it a little bit, especially now that I'm not doing this style as often as I used to. Okay, now before this completely dries, I'm going to go in with a smaller brush. I have a 3 round brush. I'm going to take some of this lemon yellow. It's nice and thick, and I'm going to add this in here for our kind of iconic yellow center. Now I'm doing this before it completely dries because I do want some of this to bleed. But before that dries, I'm going to go in with some of this raw sienna mix. I'm going to add this into. This will help to add a little bit of depth to this piece and a little bit of interest. A little bit of the burnt sienna and or burnt umber going into the very tips. Very kind of bottommost tips. So as though it's darker at the bottom, at the base, and it goes upwards. And that will just help that to bleed nicely. Okay, for this next peony, it's going to be a slightly different shape, and I'm going to change the camera angle, which will hopefully give you a slightly different view and give you a different perspective. So here's our first peony. I just moved the camera, so this is all still very wet. See these beautiful colors bleeding together. They're mixing around. They have a similar value. So I'm actually going to pick up value, meaning how light and how dark something is. So I'm going to take my brush. It's a little bit damp. This is the brush I was just using. I'm just going to pick up some sections And I'll go back in later and add a little bit more of that lemon yellow, just so it has a little bit more definition. This isn't necessarily something that most people would do when they're working loose, but it's just my style to have a little bit more detail mixed in with some of this more playful style. So again, just kind of picking a little bit up. I usually have to do it twice in the same area so that it gets good and dry and the color doesn't bleed into it. But by working with this damp brush in such a small area, it's not going to look irregular or like I made a mistake. Okay, so moving on to this one right here. I'll still be talking through what I did, but for the first one, I really wanted you to be able to see exactly what I was doing as far as like picking up pigment and adding different things. All right, so for this piece, we're going to be adding a little bit of a stem as well. It'll be more like a bud. We're going to start with the petal that is closest to us, and we'll need to work quickly because I'm going to need to blend it into the stem a little bit more. So loading up our brush, going to add a little bit more water, not too much, and get this irregular top. And then adding more pigment, some of our thicker pigment, to the very base. You can go in here with a contrasting color or just something with a little bit more variety in it. So sometimes I'll just pull out some unmixed alizarin crimson, so like some raw alizarin crimson. Let's actually do that real quick. Pull a little bit of that and just dab it at the base, and that will help to give it a little bit more dimension, a little bit more depth. Okay, let's go into the side. How big do we want this bloom? Now notice I'm leaving some white space here. That will help to give us some definition and guide the eye of the viewer so they know what's going on. It's just kind of a little bit of a clue. It's kind of like having an outline to their piece. And I want these two to bump into each other just a little bit. See how these are getting lighter as they're going a little bit farther away? That is intentional. It's very planned. And then these petals that'll be here are going to be much softer. This is going into the background a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to quickly clean off my brush, grab some sap green and some of that terre verte, which is a little bit thicker now that it's been sitting. I'm going to pop this in the bottom. So I'm just tapping that into my still slightly wet pigment. That will allow that to bleed a little bit. All right. How is this constructed? Okay. One thing I see a lot with loose watercolor artists is their stems will not be thick enough to support a flower. Make sure that you have a stem that looks like it could hold a flower up. And that it's coming from the right spot. So now we're going to work on the leaves real quick. I'm pushing down on the brush. See how the barrel of the brush is flattening out and giving me a much more interesting shape. These will be softer because they're a little farther away. All right, let's do something a little, let's do one here, being overlapped by this beauty. And then you can fake a little bit of a color bleed here by just kind of tapping that in, which is something that I like to do. If I didn't quite get the bleed in, I sometimes like to fake it. Going in with the burnt umber that we had already pulled out. And I'm just going to kind of add this to one side. That's kind of extra, you don't need to do that. But I don't like that we haven't repeated that. So let's add a little bit more of the Terre Verte and the sap green, just to give that something to blend into. Jumped into the leaves a little too quickly. If I had my wits about me a little more, I would have played with the stem while it was still wet. I'm going to take that same green color we have. I'm also going to take some of the alizarin crimson and mix it in with it. It will desaturate it and darken it just a touch in order to, and not a ton, you don't need a ton, you just kind of want to mix a darker neutral green. And I'm going to use that as our shadow. So I should have done that instead of the burnt umber, but sometimes you got to try something in order to realize that didn't work. Okay, I'm going to add some depth by just adding a little bit more of a hint of some greenery here. Peony leaves kind of spread out, so we're going to do that. That a little bit more. And then I think we're going to be done. I think we're going to call that done. That's where I am going to stop today. Pen or paintbrush down. This is the piece. The composition is not my favorite. I would probably change some things. I might have another bud down here, or we could have just done a cluster, which is what I featured in my last peony, loose peony video. If you are interested in seeing other loose watercolor videos, I do 1 or 2 a year. So this is another one that I created last year, and then this was also published last year. So I do 1 or 2 every single year, and I would love to hear what you would like to see next. I thought maybe a rose would be interesting. It's very similar to the peony technique, but the center is completely different, and that does change the overall look. So if you'd be interested in seeing something like that, let me know in the comment section down below, or if there's another flower that you want to see in this loose style, I'd love to hear your ideas. And until next time, happy painting. Don't fall, camera. Don't fall. Have you met Florence? It's one of my girls.